So welcome, everyone. Good morning. I'm Marjorie Turner, Senior Vice President for Program Planning and Management here at the Urban Institute, and I'm really delighted to welcome you here on this rainy morning. Today's event is going to dive into the important issue of the role of community colleges in higher education and workforce development. Community colleges are a really important access point for many low-income students, for adults going back to school to improve their opportunities and their job skills, and for others who don't have access to or feel they're not likely to succeed in a four-year college. So our goal today is to understand more about the role of community colleges, the successes that they've had, but also the struggles that they're facing. So to help us do that, we have a really terrific panel of speakers who will be discussing two recently published research briefs on issues central to community colleges. And the work they'll be discussing today sheds light on policies that are aimed at improving workforce development and on variations in institutions across the community college sector. It's really clear that in today's challenging economy, finding ways to improve opportunities, improve outcomes for Americans who don't have four-year college degrees is really critical. The Obama administration has praised the community college sector for its role in this work. They've devised proposals for subsidizing these institutions, and they've proposed a national policy for eliminating tuition at community colleges. So as we transition to the next administration, we will soon be discovering what approach President-elect Trump and his team will be taking in this space. We hope today's discussion will help set the stage for that decision-making by the new administration and the new Congress by providing some solid evidence about the current state of affairs and sharing some tested policy solutions. So this event is really a part of a growing body of work here at the Urban Institute on higher education, broadly defined. And I want to acknowledge two of our speakers who are part of the Urban Institute's team working on these issues, Sandy Baum and Lauren Eister. Sandy recently published a book, Student Debt, Rhetoric and Realities of Higher Education Financing, which focuses on some of the lesser known, less obvious stories about higher education financing and student debt. For example, she highlights the fact that there are a number of people who have small amounts of debt but who started college and never finished it, never earned a degree, and that they may be the people who are, in some cases, struggling the most with the student debt issues. Lauren has been studying community colleges' efforts to train youth and adults, both for in-demand jobs for many years. She evaluates both federal and foundation initiatives that aim at improving programs and services for students to succeed not only when they're in school, but then when they transition to the workforce. So finally, I'd just like to say a few words about our moderator, who will then give you full introductions for all the panelists. David Wessel is Senior Fellow in Economic Studies at Brookings and Director of the Hutchins Center on Fiscal and Monetary Policy. He joined Brookings in December 2013 after 30 years on the staff of the Wall Street Journal, where most recently he was economics editor and wrote the weekly Capital column. He's still a contributing correspondent to the Wall Street Journal and can often be heard as we commute in the morning on NPR's Morning Edition. David's broad engagement with economic issues has led him to an interest in community colleges as a really key driver in the workforce development field and in expanding economic opportunity. He's called attention to the importance these institutions play for the overall health of our economy going forward. So we're really delighted to have him here today to moderate. And before I turn it over to David and the whole panel, I want to encourage everybody in the audience to extend this important dialogue beyond the room by sharing your thoughts or observations using the hashtag #LiveAtUrban. And also for those joining us on the webcast, to join the conversation that we'll be having today, send your questions to events@urban.org. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, David.
Thank you very much, Marjorie. I'm very pleased to be here. You correctly mentioned that I've had a long interest in community colleges. So I'm very pleased to be joined here. I'll just go down the line. Sandy Baum, as Marjorie said, is a senior fellow here at the Urban Institute, professor emerita of economics at Skidmore, and she has for a long time been writing about college and college finance, particularly her widely referred to publications from the College Board's annual publications, Trends in Student Aid and Trends in College Pricing, which not only has good information, but unlike most stuff that's put out, you can actually find the data you want, which is my standard. Unfortunately, one that's not widely met in the policy space. But we have another conference on that. David Boehm is a senior vice president for government relations and policy analysis at the American Association of Community Colleges. David, like me, went to Haverford College, which is not a community college. Lauren Eister is a senior research associate here who, as Marjorie said, has done a lot of work on community colleges. And then we're very pleased to have Dan Phelan, who is not only the president and chief executive of Jackson College in Michigan, but now chairman of the board of the American Association of Community Colleges. And unlike everybody else in this panel, he actually has an associate's degree, right? Is Mount St. Clair College considered a community college?
It was a 2-year college at the time. It's now a 4-year institution and has since closed.
Oh, great. Wow.
That's saying a whole lot.
As you can see, I didn't prepare very well for this. So I thought our plan to, well, let me first, I want to get a sense of the audience. So how many people in the audience have actually been on a community college campus? Okay, and how many people here consider themselves familiar with community colleges? Okay, so we have a kind of a fairly knowledgeable group, but not everybody. I just want to put a few facts, particularly for people who may be watching online, so then we can go beyond the community colleges as a solution to all our problems, and they're wonderful, and celebrate, because one of my observations is that there's sometimes a tension between the desire of people in the community college movement to call attention to what community colleges do well and their important role in our society, which leads people to be a little afraid to be self-critical and to say, you know, some things we could do better. So I'm hoping we can be constructive in and there's a lot of good models out there without feeling that we have to repeatedly genuflect. Of course, community colleges are the answer to all our problems. As many of you know, community colleges enroll about 40% of all undergrads, about 25% of all full-time undergrads. Every recent president has somewhere in his first term discovered community colleges, often discovering them as if no previous president even knew they existed. I think that's partly because they recognize the need for some institution in our society to better improve the social mobility and to close the gap between the skills that workers have and the skills that employers demand. I think we know that too many students start community colleges and don't finish a program, don't get a credential or degree. This is something that the AACC itself has called attention to in their very thoughtful Reclaiming the American Dream report in 2012. Even when students come to a community college with aspirations at stating that they want to transfer, most of them don't ever manage to transfer. We are, in case you haven't noticed, in Washington. The federal government, and we sometimes, I think, in Washington, overdo the role of the federal government in education in general. Just a fact which Sandy helped me find, which I deleted in my thing, so you can give me the numbers. It's about 50% state and local.
Those were from the Trends in College Pricing.
Yeah, I typed
state
by
local versus federal. I don't have the numbers.
51%.
State, thank you.
Right, and about
35% federal.
Federal.
No, I'm sorry. Tuition.
Debt tuition. So
Debt
about
tuition.
half state and local money, a little more than a third tuition. The rest is federal, but of course some of that tuition is actually delivered in the form of federal aid. And then I think one of the things we want to talk about today is, A, there's been a lot of attention to community colleges by the federal government. We want to explore what's worked and what hasn't, so we do more of the first and less of the second. And secondly, and I think this is incredibly important, Community colleges are not nearly as much alike as people think, and there are important differences among community colleges. The communities they serve, it's a lot different being where Dan is in Jackson, Michigan, and than it is being in the heart of Chicago. But it's also true that among community colleges who serve similar populations, there are good ones and bad ones. And I think there's something to be learned about what goes well and what doesn't go well. And so we're going to talk about that to try and get away from the generalizations. And finally, I think it's just incredibly, if you read the New York Times, you think that 90% of people who go to college go to the Ivy League, and the other 10% go to the University of Michigan or Berkeley. And so I think part of the goal of a program like this is to, again, emphasize to people who aren't familiar with community colleges, most of whom are not in this room or you wouldn't be here, that they are actually a much bigger slice of higher ed than you get in reading the national press, although at the local level, people know, because if you go to any high school, even in Montgomery County, many of the kids end up at community colleges, and when you talk to employers, they know what the community college is and can tell you with a great length what they do well and not. So we decided not to have opening presentations, but I'm going to ask each of the panelists a kind of leading question and let each of them say something, and then we'll have a dialogue, and at about 10:30 we'll turn to questions from the audience and from people who email them into events@urban.org. So thank you for your indulgence. So Sandy, as I mentioned, your piece really emphasizes the variation among community colleges. There's a lot of different models, a lot of different populations. In what ways do you think it's useful to think about how they differ, and how does that affect federal policy, which often has trouble distinguishing between different sorts of institutions?
Yeah, so David and I wrote this brief together, and we decided to focus on variation because so much of the conversation about community colleges, partly because people are not so familiar, makes it sound like they're monolithic. So either people talk about community colleges as, here's a way to start your education at a low price, and then you'll transfer to a four-year college, and you'll have a cheaper bachelor's degree. Or community colleges are all about workforce development, and we just need to be thinking about partnerships between the colleges and the labor force. And people think of community college students as low-income students. And so it just seemed like, let's look at all the different things that community colleges do. And it's not just that each community college does a variety of things, but that the balance is very different at different colleges. So I think that most of the national conversation lately, and I suspect this might change, has been about free community college. Just like, let's have something that people won't have to pay to go to. And that in and of itself is a policy that really ignores differences in the financing models, right? Because, tuition for a full-time, full-year student in California is about $1,500, and most low-income students don't pay it because tuition is waived. But if you live in Vermont and go to a community college, tuition is about $7,500 for a full year. So what it would mean to make it free is entirely different in those locations, and also obviously implementing anything like that would be entirely different. Moreover, if you look at a place like California, the problem is obviously that there's a high cost of living, and even if you're not paying tuition, you have to figure out how to live. So how does the problem address that? And so I think that looking at those funding differences means that when you just speak about it in a concept like that, it doesn't get to the point. I think we're going to see lots more state, local efforts at community college free, and I think we still have to pay attention to those and think about, wait a minute, is that an appropriate policy for the community colleges that you're dealing with? But even more than that, if you look at, so the demographics in Minnesota, more than 3/4 of community college students are white. But in many places, a very small minority is white. In some places, more than half of the students really are trying to prepare to transfer. In other places, very few of them are doing that. That's a problem because one of the things we want to do, I think, is encourage, productive lines of study. We know that one thing that works in all ways is more structure. But what do? Do you try to encourage people to prepare to transfer? That's a problem because if you just get an associate degree in liberal arts, it's probably not going to pay off in the labor force. But I think other things, as we think about the federal role, not just about financing, but about providing guidance, and that's all it can really be for institutions. Think about something like developmental education. So we know that a lot of students at community colleges are not getting anywhere because we don't know how to do remedial education. But don't we have to think about it in different ways? If what we're talking about is preparing students to be able to get bachelor's degrees, or if we're saying we're asking students who are preparing for specific occupational paths to learn all kinds of things and show expertise in them or competency in them that they're never going to need and that they don't really need. So again, a general policy like this, I think we need to really think about variation in that sense. So basically, the idea, I think, is that we have to stop just talking about this as these are community colleges, this is what community colleges do, and try to come up with ways to be more nuanced about their needs.
So if you were trying to draw me a grid to look on the various ways in which community colleges differ, you said one is how they're financed, how much they depend on tuition, varies a lot from state to state. I imagine both across states and within states, it varies how much there are, how many of the kids go on, or students go on to four-year degrees. That's a big difference. The nature of the demographics of their student body, are they immigrants, low-income people whose parents didn't go to college, or are they in some white working-class suburb where most of the people, so that's a difference.
Right.
Are there other vectors on which you think it's important?
Well, I mean, one issue is like in some states, more than half of the public college students are in community colleges, and some, like Alaska, doesn't even have a community college system. So that's all these things are related because the percentage of students in community colleges is related to the demographics of who goes to community colleges. But I think the goals, I mean, that's just really important. What are the goals of most of the students enrolled in the institution?
Right, I see. Lauren, you've done, in your nice brief, you summarized the alphabet soup of efforts that the federal government has made over the last several years to give incentives to community colleges and community college systems and state governments and local governments to do more, most of it around workforce training. I wonder if you could pick a couple that you think are particularly interesting and what we know, and or as you pointed out to me earlier, what we're going to learn when we get some good evaluations.
There is a basis of knowledge out there right now and some evidence, and some strong evidence about these sector approaches, these industry approaches. And so I think a lot of the work that the federal government has been funding towards community colleges and workforce development in community colleges is based on this sector approach and really tying what programming does with employer needs. And there are some really positive benefits to the students in their completion as well as their employment. So we're seeing that, and this is part of the drive of what community colleges are doing. But that's a really kind of broad concept,
right? So
right?
give us some specifics.
Exactly. So, you know, things like we're seeing sector partnerships in which community colleges, the workforce system, and employers come together and really develop those strategies, whether it's thinking about how to do competency-based education for a particular industry or occupation, and that's where somebody masters skills along the way. They build those skills and then demonstrate that competency rather than having time in their seat. There are career navigators, student success navigators. President Phelan and I were just talking about that, really helping students be able to kind of pull together their plan for their college time, whether it's to complete a program at the community college, to transfer on, really think about that student success so they're not wasting time taking classes they don't need, so they're advancing beyond the remedial education that maybe they need. And then we're seeing other instructional pieces like integrated instruction for those who are really starting out with some basic skills deficits and integrating math, English into the technical coursework. So there's a lot out there. They're seeing positive results, but it's early and some of the efforts are pretty small. So I think the remaining questions are how do you sustain them and how do you scale them?
So if the new education secretary, Betsy DeVos, came to you and said, they're going to cut my budget, so I got to decide which of the federal programs that are aimed at community college that are not vouchers to send your kids to parochial schools should I preserve? What example would you give her of one that you think has promise? What specific program?
I mean, I truly do think it's individualized to the college, to their local labor market, and which employers they're working with, their student population. I mean, I think, you know, Sandy and David's brief really highlight that variation because you've really got to know your student population.
Does the federal government do anything? I mean, why do we need the federal government for that? That ought to be something
right.
that So, so would you tell her they have enough incentive to do that stuff? Or is there something that the federal government does that provides incentives for that kind of stuff?
Well, I think the workforce system and working with them to do those kinds of things, but the approaches that really seem to work are those that really focus on the student needs, the student navigator, as well as the segmenting of programs in a way that make logical sense. The modularized, the self-paced, the skill-based programs that really can focus a student, especially if they're having trouble.
David, let me ask you that same question a different
Okay.
way. So the
Go
federal
ahead.
government, we have a choice. We could spend a lot more money on students. We could have more Pell grants. We could have more carefully designed student loans. Or we could provide programs that are more targeted at particular needs that the federal government would like to encourage community colleges to do. How do you think about the trade-off there, or am I making a false dichotomy?
I think it kind of is a false dichotomy to the extent that the amount of money that the federal government provides to community college students dwarfs all the other investments that the government makes through its vast array of programs that benefit individual colleges for particular purposes. So, for example, the Pell Grant program provides roughly, now it's a little bit below, but roughly $10 billion every year to community college students. That's through the Pell Grant program alone. The amount of funding that the community colleges get through the Targeted Career and Technical Education Program, the Carl Perkins Act, is roughly $300 million a year, and through the Workforce Investment and Opportunity Act, Lauren, you may have a more precise number than me, but it's less than $1 billion provided for vouchers and some direct support for institutions to do workforce training. So the overarching, and from our perspective, by far the most important role that the federal government has is providing cash for students to afford our institutions. As Sandy mentioned, about 35% of institutional revenues now come in the form of tuition. That represents roughly about $20 billion in aggregate or so, or the total revenue stream of our institutions. And as I just mentioned a moment ago, $10 billion of that alone is provided through the Pell Grant program. So that gives you an idea of the tremendous investment. Now, in terms of the rationale for the federal government's investment in some of these workforce programs, you know, there is no overall federal manpower policy, as you well know, for in any area, and that includes community colleges. What has happened over time, including with some presidential initiatives that you referred to in your opening statement, is that particular needs of community colleges and particular priorities of the government at that time and really cutting-edge approaches to workforce development have been financed through the federal government, but it will never replace the basic operating support for institutions, both for programs of the academic side as well as the vocational technical side. And one other thing I would like to say is that as we think about the rationale for federal investment in these programs, we're looking, of course, to the outcomes and the outputs of well-trained students to take jobs in a variety of high-priority fields. And, of course, we have safeguards to ensure that state and local government, the workforce investment boards, are involved in making sure that the training funds are spent in areas for which there's an employer demand. But another justification for it that sometimes doesn't get as much attention as it might is the basic underfunding, or certainly insufficient funding, that our colleges receive for technical training programs in particular, which are much more expensive than your basic academic program. So from our point of view, if we can get the federal government to augment and enhance in an effective way the workforce mission of our colleges, given the funding situation, we think that it's prudent for the government to do that.
Yeah, I found Sandy's email to me, just so we get the right facts on the table. 35% net tuition revenue, some of which, as David said, comes from the form of student aid from the federal government. 51% state and local appropriations, and 14% everything else, federal appropriations and various grants and contracts. Dan, tell us a little bit from the point of view of Jackson. Why don't you tell us a little bit about Jackson, and then I want you to tell me, how do you measure success? What is the definition of success for the students who come to Jackson?
A little bit about Jackson College. We've been around since 1928. We are one of 28 community colleges in the state of Michigan. We are a comprehensive community college. And our makeup is a little bit different. When community colleges were created in Michigan in 1917, it was conceived that revenues would come 1/3 from students, 1/3 from the local property taxpayer, and 1/3 from the state. there is a huge variation because the local property tax is a decision of the local taxpayer. At Jackson College, for example, only 11% of our revenue comes from the local property owner. Tuition actually is about 55% of our total revenue stream. And so we've also got a little bit of a disinvestment from the state. So it's a very different kind of situation. And also the millage amounts for Jackson College are different than, say, Oakland County in the metropolitan Detroit area. So huge variations.
People have to vote on the tax levy?
The local tax, they absolutely do. And unfortunately, Jackson College is the only community college in Michigan with its original charter millage, which got back in 1964. It took 2 times to get that millage. And there have been 13 attempts to try to get additional support, but they have failed on every occasion. The local taxpayers love the institution. They love us. They talk highly about us, but they feel like they've done their bit for king and country. They don't want to give more money to the community college. In fact, you're actually seeing this swing from private good to public good, where when we have focus groups, they will actually say to us, listen, why should I pay more taxes so that she can go and get an associate's degree? She's going to get more money with that job, so if she's going to get more money, let her pay for it. So that's the narrative we hear in Jackson County. But other communities, say Ann Arbor, Washtenaw Community College, you put a ballot or the issue on the ballot, you got it passed. So very highly educated community, and in Jackson County, about 70% of the population does not possess a post-secondary credential of any kind. So we've got a real big challenge in trying to talk about the value add of an additional property tax to be able to support the economic development, trying to draw those connective lines, if you will. With regard to what constitutes success, I think that there are 2 strands of that thought. One is what the student considers success to be. I think that that's important. They come in with a particular set of thoughts. They may have a clear indication of what their own knowledge, skills, and abilities are. That may be different than what is practical and obtainable from, say, an employer's point of view. Maybe they don't have the skill sets that they need. You've also got the employer's perspective. What does this person coming into my institution actually know? What does an A mean to me when you come in and you got say a B in business and an A in accounting? What does that mean to the person who has maybe a lesser academic Carnegie unit standing? What does that mean? And then you've got the institutional perception. Success is defined by our Board of Trustees. We're a policy governance institution. Our board is real clear about data. We're focused on data and helping to inform decision making. So our board has established 12 different matrices with multiple subcomponents that I have to hit every year. We also have a number of federal standards that are coming.
Give us an example of the ones that the boards have set for you.
So let's take, for example, diversity, an important one of 12. That is the primary focus of each of our board meetings each month. We take one of the 12. Let's take diversity, for example. It has a narrative about all of the work that we're doing on there, but clearly our board has a standard set for the percentage of employment diversity, student diversity, and its relationship to the city, county, and to the state. And that's important, not only in terms of the individuals who are there, but then also the success rate of those individuals coming on the outside. And we go into a deep dive and give that information to our board. We have others on student success overall, international, college safety, student services, the workforce, which is the perception and the experience of our employees within the college itself. So we're very focused on those. Those align with Malcolm Baldrige National Quality Award Standards. They align with our accrediting standards as well, which is AQIP, Academic Quality Improvement Process, again, built on the Malcolm Baldrige National Quality Criteria.
David, how well do we measure how well community colleges do, and what is the pluses and minuses of all this accountability? Let's look at their wages, how long they take to graduate and stuff. What is it that you think we do well, and what is it that we do that's not well?
Well, in the opinion of my organization, we're failing in probably the most important respect where we ought to be succeeding, and that is in terms of just the basic core federal data. The IPED's data collection, which most people in the audience will be familiar with, is reported by institutions. It doesn't track individual students. It only captures students in the official rates for 150% of the normal time. So in the case of community colleges, that would be for 3 years, and that's the official rate that the government reports. It excludes transfer students. And so for the official community college rate the Department of Education publishes, it's 21%. The National Student Clearinghouse just 2 days ago released its latest 6-year data on how those same full-time students fare if you track them out 6 years, and give them credit for graduating from any institution, including those that they did not enter, and it becomes 55%. So the government doesn't follow individual students. It's a college reporting what they know about their students, and it's only for a limited period of time. We believe that that is a really fundamental failure on the part of the government. There are all sorts of political and policy differences about why that is the way it is, but we're very hopeful that that will be changed in the reauthorization of the Higher Education Act whenever that occurs. There's all
Tuesday.
Better get busy. So we another component of success, Dan referred to this, is the issue about what happens to students after they leave institution to higher education. And here too, there's a tremendous amount of difference of opinion about how you should evaluate institutional effectiveness. There's pretty broad consensus that students should graduate and get credentials, but even within institutions and policy circles, there's some debate about that because there are some pockets of data which show that a few courses can enable students to maintain a job that they might otherwise have lost or upgrade a skill that enables them to get a better job, even without any kind of credential, and that includes these industry certifications that we're hearing more and more about. There was a very interesting study done by Peter Baer at the University of Michigan looking at California students showing that what he called skills builders, students who just took 2 or 3 courses were enabled to get or maintain certifications which help them with their jobs. However, the primary indicator that we believe the government should be collecting that it is not currently collecting that would reflect on institutional performance are the earnings of students, the post-graduation or post-attendance workforce experience they have. The best means of getting that data at this point in time is through either the Social Security Administration or perhaps the IRS willing or Congress mandating. And there is resistance to creating the data system that would allow the government to do that. In fact, the Higher Education Act includes a ban on a unirecord data system which would allow the government to follow students through and institutions through each of the institutions that they attend and then out into the workforce. Now, there's a lot of difference of opinion about how you measure fairly what those earnings should be, what the increment should be, when you should measure that. Of course, there are some people who think that college is not primarily about earnings. They think that it's about other things that students gain in the course of their education. But in the absence of having an accurate graduation rate and knowing how students fare economically when they get out of college via the federal government, we think, as I mentioned, that the government has a long way to go into providing some of the basic data that consumers and policymakers need. Some of this data is being collected by states. There are some private entities, some foundations are supporting work where some of this information is being gathered, but on a comprehensive basis, we're not there yet.
Do you want? I wanted to ask you something else.
Oh, okay. I just wanted to comment on
Yes, please.
2 things that were. One is that everybody should look at Judy Scott Clayton's recent paper on metrics for success, and her main point is that you can't have one metric. And so I think that this, in light of this discussion, this is really important because certainly we don't want to say college is either about post-college earnings or about other things. It's obviously about both of those things, and if anything, I mean, we should definitely be worried about the national focus on it being just earnings. We need more earnings data, obviously. But the other thing I wanted to go back to was actually based on what David said about Pell Grants and how important they are in terms of the federal contribution to community colleges. And I'm all for a very large Pell Grant contribution to all students, not just community college students. But I think that this is very related to what I was talking to you about the problems with like just trying to make it free, that if we only focus on how students pay for it, which is so much of the current focus, we are ignoring what they are paying for and the limited resources that community colleges have to make it possible for students. And so I feel like, I mean, what we've done is we just hand the students money. Here's the voucher argument, right? We hand them money and we say, go off, good luck. And this is not working very well. We need to do more for these students and for these institutions so that the students have more guidance in making their choices and so that the institutions have more resources to offer what it takes for students to succeed. So I just wanted to, I mean, not to, you know, I certainly don't mean to be attacking the federal contribution to Pell Grants, but we need much, much more than that.
Lauren, could you talk a little bit about what we've learned that on the workforce development thing that community colleges have done particularly well, and where you think there's the most room for improvement?
Sure. I think one really key piece that community colleges are doing well and really making Herculean efforts is to make changes across their system. So trying to think about how to design programs in a way that support getting credentials, completing courses, developing policies that help them access potentially public benefits that they're entitled to, that they can access other, financial aid, that there are policies within schools that, different departments are working with adult education, or they're working, within their community college to make changes to how they operate to support student success. So I think that's a really big thing. It's hard to say there's an impact because it's a system-wide kind of thing within colleges, across states.
Mm-hmm.
That states are driving some of those policy changes that we're really seeing how they're changing. If you look at a state like Kansas, they've gone to a tiered funding model, and so there's different reimbursement rates for more academically liberal arts oriented courses versus CTE courses, which cost more. So there are some ways that states and local colleges are driving that. And I think we're going to see longer run impacts from that. Where they're really challenged, though, I think is what you're asking, is to sustain that. So if you don't have that level of systems support, how do you sustain that? So you have these kind of boutique interventions that maybe happen within one department and it's working well, but there's no money to replicate it across college or in other colleges. So I think that's a real challenge without that system support to make that happen.
Dan, this is a caricature, but I'm sure you know what I mean. So once upon a time, because of the way state legislators funded community colleges, the college was relatively indifferent whether I had one student one semester, another student the second semester, another student the third semester, because you were paid for the seats you filled. And there has been a strong sense, as I mentioned earlier, that that wasn't really in the interests of students, and that we needed to find a better way to you use the Navigator line to guide students so that people who come to community colleges with some aspiration of getting a certificate or a transfer are more likely to complete it. And I think collectively we recognize this is going to take a little more guidance counseling than was the norm at community colleges, which were never not exactly endowed like Princeton University. So I'm told that you have had some success in this counseling Navigator thing. I don't know anything about it, so I can't ask a more specific question, but I'll touch play and you'll talk.
Okay, push that button. Well, I think your characterization is not too far off. Actually, when junior colleges were created, when the likes of Starr Jordan and William Rainey Harper and those conceived a junior college, it was about access in lots of ways. And we've been providing that access very distinctively for many, many years. And in fact, initiatives like the veterans coming home, the GI Bill, the way we responded, that was about access. But clearly, as we've gone along kind of chronologically, we have found that the citizen taxpayer, the federal government, and others have begun asking different questions. And that is, what is the value add for the dollar I'm contributing? Let's put a laser focus on this topic, and rightly so. And so the idea of not only access but success has now been introduced in the narrative, and incentives are moving in that direction. In fact, we have states like Ohio where 100% of the state aid is awarded based on the performance of the institution. In Michigan, about 25% of our state aid is allocated. And this is not new money. This is the money you've always gotten before is now carved out for performance. And we're seeing an increasing number of states either with existing legislation or pending legislation moving in that direction. Well, for us, there are lots of challenges that students have. Community colleges serve a vast array of students with lots of challenges in their life. We don't get to pick and choose. We are an open-door institution. So we say, bring your poor, your tired, your huddled masses, and we will come and we will help you and we'll meet you where you are. And truth is, that requires a lot of human intervention. And we have been trying to stay at a level where we believe for a long time we've got to keep tuition as low as possible, and we'll do the best that we can. Well, for us to do the best that we can, it's going to require more human intervention, and that requires personnel. I will tell you at Jackson College, up until a few years ago, where we decided to change our focus, our perspective, we had one advisor for every 1,437 students. We were into transaction, but we had tuition very, very low. We had a conversation. We'd been doing lots of research, visited other colleges, visited private industry, did lots of research, read great papers, and we thought we need to flip this on its head. And so I remember the planning session we had with the Board of Trustees, and we talked to them about this as being a moral question. Is it morally better for us to keep tuition as low as possible, knowing that some 16% are going to complete an associate's degree, and some more are going to get some kind of employment, and maybe some will transfer to baccalaureate degree? But clearly less than 50% overall. Is that morally the best decision? Or is it better morally to raise tuition so that we can have the staffing, so we can clear a 20% hurdle for completion of the associate's degree, that we can get up to 60, or what we're proposing, 70% completion rate? Is that the better moral answer? And we prevailed, and the board believed that was the right thing to do. So then we said, how do we move? How do we scale this up? We've got lots of boutique programs, TRIO grant programs, lots of things, and we know what works well. Individuals working with small groups of people yield great returns in terms of persistence from semester to semester, fall to fall, completion, great returns. So we knew we had to have people intervening. So we asked the Board of Trustees, will you, realizing state aid is going down, realizing we can't pass a millage to save our soul, so the only thing left we have in Michigan is to raise tuition. We asked our board, will you let us raise tuition at a non-standard rate? For us, the first year was 7.3%, the second year 8%. And what we will do is we'll get rid of the Navigator, and we will talk about a student success navigator, we called it. And we said this person will be assigned a certain portion of the alphabet, and they will own that student, a client-based model. So when you come onto our campus, we know you, we know your dog's name, we know where you're planning on going, what you want to study, no matter how many times you change it, and we'll follow you all the way through. We'll make sure you meet your faculty. We'll make sure that you get your textbooks. We'll make sure you know where the classroom is, and if you're in difficulty, we will escort you to the Center for Student Success, and we'll stay with you even if it's 6 years to the end of time. Well, we actually acquired those people, changed the model, brought them aboard. We have now enough student success navigators at Jackson College that we have one navigator to 200 students. And I will tell you that right now we're just a year and a half into it. The persistence data from semester to semester, fall to fall, is improving. And I will also tell you the qualitative measures, how students feel about their experience, how they feel that the navigators know them, know their interests, know what they're focused on, call them, has gone off the charts. We're in the 90th percentile for everything. And these navigators have a responsibility to call every student every semester 3 times with hard contacts. That means I'm talking to you on the phone, we're visiting, and 3 face-to-face contacts. And that could be a Skype contact, or you're in my office and we're having the conversation. It has fundamentally changed our focus, and we've put our motto around this called Total Commitment to Student Success, or TCS squared. So all that we do has an unwavering focus on student success, how we spend our money, the decisions we ask the board to approve, our focus, our strategic plan. That's the model we're using, and we think that it's going to be a model for long-term success at other institutions, but it is resource intent. And you've got to struggle with that moral question, that moral balance.
What is your tuition now?
Right now, we're at $135 a semester credit hour plus $40 in universal fees.
So what does that work out to?
$175 for an in-district student. About $4,200 a year for 24 semester credit hours.
So that's high relative to the...
Yes, it is. It's in the top third, I think, according to your data.
Sandy, I don't think we can have a conversation about this without talking about student debt. And I do recommend your book. But I think sometimes people mistake the fact that they think of everybody, they have this image, there's a whole lot of people going to community colleges who are graduating with $25,000 in student loans, and those are the people who are being, who are defaulting and stuff. Could you just give us a little snapshot of, well, the community college student actually is less dependent on student loans than many others, but tell us a little bit about what's interesting there.
So, I mean, I think talking about student loans for community college students is complicated by the fact that what we actually hear most often now is about the high default rates of community college students. So the default rates of students who graduate from community colleges and for-profit institutions are about the same as the default rates of students who don't graduate, leave school without a credential from four-year public and private nonprofit institutions. So they're very high. That said, a very small percentage of students at community colleges actually borrow. So maybe 20%. I mean, it's increasing. But most of them don't borrow. And when they do borrow, many of them are going to borrow $5,000 to $10,000. And then some of them are going to borrow $20,000, $30,000. But the levels of debt are much lower than they are for four-year students, which is a good thing because, of course, their earnings are much lower. One of the problems is, it's concentrated. There are some community college students who are absolutely borrowing too much. Some people will tell you that they're borrowing the money, they get a refund, and that's how they're living. And some community colleges wish
They get a refund. You mean they're borrowing more than the tuition?
Well, they borrow more than the tuition.
And they're living on
program, but which is a totally reasonable thing for them to do, is to live on it, because how else are they going to live? But I think at community colleges there's tension. So many community colleges don't even offer access to federal loans for their students because they're afraid that their students will default, and then they'll lose access to Pell grants. So that's a problem, because then students have to go to the private loan market or work excessively or whatever. So, I mean, I think there's a lot of tension over this. We don't want too many community college students to borrow too much, because the reality is that many of them don't complete, and many who do complete credentials that don't have good labor market value. So I don't want to say we should stop worrying about community college students borrowing. But the people we should worry most about, again, is those who borrow a little bit and don't complete. And student loans can actually help students to get through college and to complete. So we need to get a more balanced view of it.
I'm not sure who to address this to, so I'll let anybody take it. So the president talked a lot about this College Promise program. We're going to free community college tuition across. And of course, it hasn't passed Congress, but there's been quite a bit of activity at the state and local level on that. So I'm not sure who's most familiar with that. Do you know much about this, Lauren or David?
I don't know.
Okay, so what's happened at the state and local level with this College Promise movement?
A tremendous amount. I mean, it's very interesting that, as you said, the legislation that was introduced to reflect the president's proposal by Democrats in both the House and the Senate has gone nowhere. I mean, there hasn't even been a hearing held on it. But nevertheless, in part through some private efforts and in part through the administration's use of the bully pulpit, there have been 3 states now that have adopted statewide promise programs. And it depends a little bit on how you count them and classify them, but more than 100 individual institutions have provided some kind of specialized incentive and price break for students that meet certain criteria, whether they're high school graduates, whether they've taken dual enrollment courses when they're in high school, whether they're from particular parts of the community, whether they're taking certain courses. So there's sort of a hodgepodge of programs, but the concept of making community college free for some portion of students has spread like wildfire across the country, and it's not even been 2 years since the president proposed the national program.
Community college is already tuition free for most low-income students, and I think this conversation sort of ignores that, like this movement, because the vast majority of very low-income community college students get a Pell Grant that will pay their tuition. And some of these programs, we have to acknowledge, they have that great message of free, but all of the extra dollars are going to people who have incomes that are too high for them to be eligible for the need-based aid.
And my big question about the free college tuition movement is, in thinking about CTE programs being more expensive, and does it really help colleges then support that kind of programming that will help people then maybe get a job afterwards, or also transfer and build those credentials to succeed. So that thinking about free college tuition just across the board, it definitely feels like it needs to be more nuanced in terms of how that
Lauren,
works.
you mentioned to me earlier that we're going to be seeing over the next year or so some really interesting evaluations. So could you just give us like the expert's guide? What will you be looking for to see over the next 12 to 18 months?
Sure. So there are several federal initiatives that we highlight in the brief. One being, and as you say, the alphabet soup. One being the Trade Adjustment Assistance Community College and Career Training Grants. These were $2 billion that went out to almost 2/3 of community colleges across the country, received some sort of funding or benefit from those grants. And almost all of these grants have third-party evaluations with them. Department of Labor encouraged them to do very rigorous designs. Not many of them could do RCTs, and we can talk for a long time about why that's really really difficult to do experimental design, I should say, or randomized controlled trials. But there's going to be a lot of information out there both on student success, both in the college and in jobs, and at least the short run piece of that. Follow-up, again, is always a challenge. But also, again, I was talking about the systems change within colleges and across systems, learning a lot about that, the innovations that became more embedded as a part of the community college policy and practice. So we're going to see a lot of that coming out. Some of the earlier rounds are starting to emerge, and you're going to see some findings from those. You're also going to see the Health Profession Opportunity Grants. This was a program that came out of the healthcare law, the ACA, and basically it supports healthcare training for low-income individuals, also those on public assistance. And it's very focused, the sectoral training approach. It happens at community colleges. It's happening with other training providers. But there's an impact study there, and that's going to be some really strong evidence that we're going to see of outcomes based on some of these more innovative approaches.
Dan, I think that one of the concerns that people have is that we've spent a lot of energy on community colleges over the years, the Lumina Foundation, the Gates Foundation. They're going to adopt a state, and they're going to make that system better, and the demonstration grants and well-meaning business and industry groups who are trying to organize. Do you think we're making progress here, and where is it that you think we've actually found ways to make community college systems stronger? What are the ones that you look at and say, this is something that worked, and where do we learn that some things haven't been as successful?
Excellent question, thank you. I think that there is a benefit in having those demonstration grants, whether they're a TAC grant, for example, or whether they're coming out of the Gates Foundation or Lumina. I think it prompts us in the field, as a field hand, it prompts us to think differently than perhaps the traditional paradigms have been. It prompts us to ask fresh questions about that which has been plaguing us for a long time. And so in that regard, I think that there's a face value to those. Some actually, I think, have a staying power. To your question, one which I think is particularly important right now is funded in part through the Gates Foundation, administered through AACC, is the Pathways Initiative. And 30 community colleges, Jackson College happens to be one of them, have been selected for about a 1.5-year study on providing a clear pathway for students to succeed through their learning experience. I remember going to graduate schools, and I had a program to study, a POS. I knew the courses that I was going to have, I knew what semester they were offered, and I knew where I was going. At some point in this higher education industry, we came to the notion that we need to let students decide. We need to toss in loco parentis out the window and say, here are lots of choices, choose. What looks interesting to you? Without nary a thought about how does this all stitch together to get you a job, to get you a meaningful, sustainable wage. Well, Pathways and the work with CCRC and other organizations like them, Davis Jenkins and others, really focused a bright light on that and said, we need to get back onto, you are experts. So take your considerable knowledge and take the industry experience and define a few very clear pathways in which students can start small, take some base courses, still do some sorting out, but as they continue their studies with you, they narrow and have a focus of study, which gives them a reasonable expectation that if I keep my nose clean academically and I move through and I work with my Navigator and I make progress in a reasonable fashion, I know that these courses are going to be offered, they're never going to be canceled, and I know by this date certain I will have my associate's degree and my credential market value, and I'll either transfer or I'll enter the marketplace. That level of predictability, that level of support around that is important. At our institution, we have established 6 pathways. It started with our faculty, which is exactly where it needed to be. And the faculty map their entire competencies. They map the program of study they need to have. They map course-to-course sequences. They mapped on where students could cross back and forth to adjust any student's variation in whatever their study needed to be. But I think Pathways has the best potential.
And you
of
attribute
enhancing
that to some of
I
the
absolutely
outside.
do. Absolutely. We've been doing lots of great things. I think Lumina and Achieving a Dream, particularly a lot of the work that Karen Stout and her predecessors have been doing, I think kind of paved the way for that. I think that was a necessary foundation for us to have. We're an ATD school as well. We continue to be. But for me, this was a nice, not a bolt-on, but this was a nice integration with the work we've already done and really allowed us to step up. And we're actually moving to aligning our academic departments with each of those 6 pathways. We're enrolling by that. We're advising by those pathways. It's really clear for the students, and they get it clear on the web, they get it clear in our catalog, and they know where they're going. So many of our students are first-generation students still. They don't understand the nuances, the terminology, the pathways. And what we've done is said, here's your roadmap. Get on the roadmap. And if you want to change, there's some exit lanes we can help you with from time to time. It's not a straitjacket, but we'll help you with that. But it is abundantly clear now to the student. We let them in on the secret, which we have retained for so long in the interest of letting students choose. And we've said, let us know if you need to adjust. And that's why having navigators are so important. So we're constantly paying attention to this student to know that she's changed her mind halfway. And, you know, I wanted to be a nurse, but now I found out after taking this class I don't like blood. Can I do something differently? And we can help them make that migration.
Sandy, let me ask you one final question before we turn to the audience and remind people who may be watching online that you can email us at events@urban.org. So I want to know whether I should be, is the glass half full or half empty? My hypothesis is that community colleges have gotten substantially better over the last couple of decades, but should we be satisfied with the rate at which they're improving? And what are the obstacles to getting the community colleges, the poor ones, up to speed and the good ones even better?
That's a really good question, and I suspect we would all have quite different
I'll ask everybody else to
answers
weigh in on
it.
that.
You know, I think it's very encouraging to see things that are going on. I mean, I listen to these stories, and I think this is really promising. I have a book coming out with Harry Holzer in the spring that talks about, you know, what are the outcomes for disadvantaged students and what could we do that would improve them, and this is the kind of thing that we talk about. But part of it, and so part of what I've been thinking about with that is, yes, we need to do everything we can to keep community colleges on this path. They are playing an incredibly important function, but I think, you know, when we talk about increasing the completion rate from, you know, 20% to 30% or 40%, we need to think about all those students who are enrolling and are not completing, which is still the majority of them. And I think we need to ask whether this is the best path for them, even if we make it a much better path for more people. So we need to be thinking at this both about how we keep community colleges both resourced, we just don't give them enough resources, and informed about ways that they can really improve the experience and playing their vital role. And we need to be thinking about alternatives for students for whom going to this classroom environment is just not right, because I think we've just sort of said, okay, that's the place we're going to put everybody who graduates from high school and can't go to a four-year college or isn't, you know, going to get a bachelor's degree. Here we have a solution for you. And it's not the solution for everyone. And so it's necessary, but it's not sufficient. We need to think much more broadly about workforce development and about providing opportunities for students who still aren't likely to succeed, at least at this point in their lives, in community colleges.
So David, I'm going to posit that you must think community colleges are doing a good job, or you can't go back to the office after this. But respond to what Sandy said, and what do you think are the biggest obstacles to improving the poor colleges and improving the good ones even so they're even better?
Well, it is a good question. In some ways, for policymakers, you know, it's the question. You know, I would not say that community colleges should be responsible, as I think Sandy was implying, maybe I misheard what you said, for all the students who aren't going to go on to four-year institutions.
No, I think she was saying that's what the society's done, and that's a mistake.
And so let me just remind you that not all students graduate from four-year institutions either. You know, the graduation rate at four-year institutions is a little bit over 70%, but it's not like as if everybody who goes to those institutions graduates as well. I do firmly believe that with the guided pathways reform that Dr. Phelan just talked about, which is being adopted by more and more institutions. And it does come down to the fact, as Kay McClenny, who some people in this room will know, puts it so aptly, that community college students don't do optional. Optional is what Tom Bailey has called the cafeteria approach to college, where you take a little of this and a little of that, and then some of the other thing, and then before you know it, you've accrued 40 credits and you're nowhere on your way to a degree. The navigators that Dan is talking about at Jackson are preventing that from happening, and it does require and mean that students don't have quite as much freedom to sample academic offerings as they might have previously. So that's one of the things that I think is going to make community colleges better. Another thing, I won't take time to go into it this morning, but is the widespread reform of developmental education. And maybe reform is the wrong term because it's almost being junked. I mean, the notion that you take a student who is at an 8th grade level or even a 6th grade level or 9th grade level and put them into a course that's designed to provide them with the basic either linguistic and related skills or mathematical skills and can get them up to college level in short order, maybe a year's time, is a model that's proven not to work. And that I won't go into it, but there are many ways that is being altered, and I think all to the benefit of getting students into community colleges more easily and getting them into programs where they're likelier to succeed. I think the headwinds that face community colleges, and I referred to them in passing before, is the fact that we are funded much less than other types of institutions are, particularly the research universities, both public and private. And for those who don't know, the average community college faculty member, unlike probably the four-year institutions that most people in this room graduated from, they teach 5 courses. Some of them teach 4 courses, but they teach 5 courses. We are lean and mean, and we do not have a lot of resources. So I do think that the resource issue is something that needs to be confronted by policymakers if we expect community colleges to perform better. It's not a cop-out, it's not an entire excuse, but it is a reality. And we also know that more and more lower-income students are being concentrated at community colleges and for-profit institutions, and we're seeing something very generally of almost a bifurcation of the college-going population between lower-income students going to art, again, the 2 that I mentioned, and more affluent students going to four-year institutions. The final thing I'll mention, another headwind that we face, never to be forgotten, we can always be hopeful that this will change, but is the underperformance of our elementary and secondary school institutions. As long as you have students, we still have over 60% of our students, however they're handled, whatever options they get when they go to college, but as long as you have over 60% of the students who, for the community college, and we're not talking Harvard College, we're talking community college, are not ready to do collegiate work, our students are going to have a very challenging time with getting those students to succeed. They have tremendous successes, but inevitably with students who are at that level of preparation, there are probably going to be some failures.
So this is optional. You don't have to say anything. If you want to add anything to what they said, great.
Just one small thing, and I think we're learning about this so much, is we use these terms, but non-traditional students versus traditional students, the younger folks coming out of high school, and as well as the adult learners who are maybe already been in the workforce, are in the workforce trying to improve themselves, or maybe they've lost a job. So how do community colleges really address different learning styles, different goals, and really thinking about those missions and how they can design programs to do that? I think there's a lot of great work going out there, so I'm going to say glass half full, but I think that's a real struggle, and I think there's a lot out there that's going on that can really support that.
You have a quick response, Dan, or if not, we'll go.
I would just say I think this is our finest hour, frankly. I think that we're incredibly innovative, and I think this is an exciting time for us. The barriers that I think we have is to get past the 30-second soundbite. I think it masquerades as iPads only recognizing first-time, full-time students in any institution. We've got to recognize that when you ask for completion, you want to be careful of the unanticipated consequences that come with that. Some of our students don't need a baccalaureate degree. They may not even need an associate's degree, but they need some kind of credential of market value. So to say success is only the achievement of an associate's degree misses the majority of what industry is looking for. So we've got to be careful for those little quick nuanced things and focus on the broader picture and allow us time and the resources to do the deeper dive to solve the problems that need to be solved. And that can't be done in 30 seconds. It's going to take some
How
time.
about 144 characters?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Okay, we have a mic.
Tweets, anyone?
If you have a question, raise your hand. Otherwise, I'll keep going. There's one in the back. Why don't you tell us who you are? And I hope someone will bring me questions online if there are any.
Maria Marta Ferreira from the World Bank. Thank you very much for great presentations. And I have a quick question for you. So going back to this point of what the market wants, I wonder what is the innovation that we're seeing in community colleges in terms of careers and skills that are being taught in response to the new demands that the industry has. Thank you.
That's a good question,
I can
Dan.
jump on that real quick. I've just finished a book about unrelenting change, and I talk about the essential nature of innovation and change in higher education. What I'm preparing our institution for, what we're working for, is recognizing that this whole notion of the Carnegie unit is really becoming an instrument, a metric that has lost its time. It's lost its value. I felt it was unfortunate that we passed on the opportunity to redefine what a Carnegie unit was. I think the new coin of the realm is going to be competency-based education. It says what a student knows and what they don't know. It crosses the bridge between non-credit workforce development and college credit. It says that we will give you a credential of competencies based on what you know. So as an employer, if I come in with a B in business and she comes in with an A, what do you know about what we know and what we don't know? If we both come in with a credential and say, I know exactly about supervision, I know exactly about doing accounting, whatever the case might be, but she doesn't, you nuance those variations. You know exactly the employee you're getting. For baccalaureate granting institutions, rather than the registrar going in and looking at that course description, generally 1 or 2 sentences, and saying, how close is this to ours? They can say, this student has mastered these concepts as identified by this faculty member, and this is what our course requires. Okay, we're going to count that as credit for the course at our institution. So for me, competency-based education is the new coin of the realm. It's the great equalizer between skill sets. And furthermore, it also allows us the opportunity to take people who don't have a stitch of credit to their name and actually capitalize on this. This is a benefit to the student. So let's say that we have a student who's embedded in Afghanistan. They come back, they don't have a stitch of credit to their name, let's say, but they were a field medic. They come in and they want to be a nurse at my institution. They need to take medical terminology. We give an assessment to them and they know 80% of the words. Rather than them being charged full tuition for a full semester, 15 weeks, we say to them, you only need 20% of this medical terminology. Study these words, come back to me in a couple weeks, and we will award 3 semester credit hours to you. You paid 25% of the cost of that tuition, and we have assessed, our expert faculty have assessed what you know and what you don't know. Go forward. This puts the student out in the workplace faster, and it reduces their cost. I think that's the biggest innovation coming to higher education, and one that I think we need to embrace.
Sir.
Hi, I'm Mike Riley from the American Association of Collegiate Registrars and Admissions Officers. About 25% of our membership are from community colleges. I have a question related to the title of the session, and
What was it?
The recovery from the recovery from the recession. And you know, as typical during the height of the recession, tremendous increases in enrollment at the community colleges, and as the economy has improved, declines. Are there any lessons learned to help mitigate some of this? I mean, this volatility. Community colleges struggle to accommodate the students at the time. Now low enrollments are challenging some of their ability to deliver. Just what might we have learned from this recession?
I can speak to one thing I've seen out there since the recession, and I think the Recovery Act funded it. TACT grants have funded a lot of online learning. That's pretty controversial in terms of how effective it is and the student success. But it has been a low-cost intervention that has helped colleges with their capacity. What we've seen some positive evidence from is blended learning. So where you have some in-classroom time, but it's matched with online learning. Things are self-paced or chunked along in a way that individuals can take advantage of that. And the college capacity can accommodate it. So I think that's one thing that they're really still experimenting with and trying to do well, but I think there's a lot of room to go on
Well,
there.
I mean, it seems to me we're not going to dampen that volatility. That's just a fact that when the job market is bad, more people are going to go to school. And when the job market gets better, fewer people are going to go to school. And that there's a secular trend and there's a cyclical thing. It seems to me the most important thing is, as Lauren suggested, to have some surge capacity that doesn't commit you to think, oh my God, we're going to have twice as many students forever, and then you end up with too much. But
I think that's really true. I mean, it seems like we would know from history that this is what happens. But it's not just enrollment, of course, it's the funding that's cyclical. And you
Right.
can't store the students up and hold them for another time. But the funding we could do something about. And I know state budgets are different from federal budgets, and it's not that simple. But we should be thinking now not only about how we're going to educate an influx of students during the next recession, but how we can do something to smooth out the
I think
funding
that's a really good point. I mean, I think we've learned a lot on the macro side about the importance of automatic stabilizers, and not to have a situation when you have a recession that the state and local governments end up contracting because their revenues go down just at the time when the demand for public services, particularly in education, go up. Over here.
Thank you very much for stimulating discussion. And
Tell us who you are, please.
yeah, I'm Sean Chow, and from the World Bank. And we often use community college as example in other countries to show how we can design an education system that could seamlessly to provide opportunities for students. So that's why I'm interested in this subject and I'm here. But my question is that, okay, for your low completion rate, it's about 20%. And could you tell the audience that among the community colleges, and how many of them really sort of in the, what we call the STEM area, and among those 20% who complete, and roughly how many of them actually also in that area? I think that's the area the country is interested in, okay? And I think we have to link to the economy and the industry. I think that's something we need to get to the bottom line. And the second, and I find this interesting that when other countries doing a lot of things about competency-based learning, and also about how to use trade tests, set up standards. So we're avoiding this situation just like you described. You know, you have an A, you have a B, and what is the difference? And is there a consideration about qualification framework, for example, in the state or in the country? In the country, probably maybe too much to ask,
Right.
but in the
Okay.
state.
So let me try and focus a little bit. So one question was about completion rates, and David, maybe you could just give us the data, and then Sandy, you could talk a little bit about how much it varies across states. But so he gave a 20% number. I'm not sure that that's.
Yeah,
Oh,
Yeah, I don't know off the top of my head. I have to plead ignorance on what the percentage of the credentials are in the STEM areas. Maybe some of the audience has that, and they can raise their hand, and they can offer that up. But I don't know the answer to that. I mean, it's a minority of our programs, our technical programs. Some of the STEM are going to be in the academic side, but some are going to be that one as well. So I think it's a pretty small minority, although there are some very good, we're talking about targeted federal investments a few minutes ago in areas where the government's decided as an interest. The National Science Foundation has a wonderful program, the Advanced Technological Education Program, which provides the ability of community colleges in cooperation with business and four-year institutions to provide the kind of technical training in the STEM areas that build the capacity at the community colleges to increase those numbers. So that's one federal program that's worked very well in that regard. Can I get to this other?
let me just explain it. So you may be right, narrowly defined STEM, but health is a huge part of
Yeah.
that.
Almost 30% of our graduates are in the health career fields. It's nursing and allied health, which is a broad range of career areas. But that's of occupational programs. I think it's our largest set of graduates, and they're sort of crown jewel programs because they feed people directly into good jobs that are portable. They can take to various places.
And the second part of his question on the standards?
Yeah, the whole area, Dan was talking a little bit about this in the context of competency-based education, but there's a desire on the part of a number of outside foundations. Illumina has taken really the lead on this, but it's not exclusively. AAC&U has done this as well, is to try to help institutions define in their course offerings what the general aptitudes that students are deriving from a course rather than just the subject matter. So it gets into analytical ability, communication ability, some quantitative abilities, even in some cases working with other students, and the team setting, which is so important in today's workplace. So it would enable the literature course at one college to be compared in terms of the aptitudes that the student get with the history course at another one, rather than just Shakespeare versus the revolutions of 1848 or what have you, and that kind of thing. Lumina's moved this very far, and I think it's something that we're going to be seeing increasing use of in the years to come.
Is that responsive? Is that responsive to your question? So give him the mic back. Try again.
No, I basically just saying, is there a thinking in terms of efficiency of the system, given the sort of low completion rate and given the difficulty for employers to make a judgment about exactly what kind of skills and competencies the graduates have, whether there's a consideration on the table to think about the trade testing and some qualification framework across different occupations, which is many countries have had that or are thinking about building that.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong, there have been periodic efforts to have national standards. There was some, I remember speaking to some group where I told them I was particularly well qualified to speak about standards and training, since I was then a journalist where we had no training and, as most people in the room, no standards. But just my impression is, so we have a lot of tension in our society about, you can see it in the discussions of the Common Core, about whether we want to have standards that cut across the country and across communities, and this constant tension about wanting local control, but wanting to have some level of minimum standards and things that can go across. And I think we haven't resolved it. So it's hard to do. It's always on the table. There are people, the National Association of Manufacturers and all that, they want to have some sort of cross-industry, cross-country thing, but there are a lot of obstacles to it because of the way we have so much in this country cherished local control, and in many cases local funding of education. It gets in the way of that.
Can I just say also, I think we have to make a distinction between college degrees and certificates and industry certifications. And it's one thing for an industry to say, we have a test you have to pass in order to be certified as, being prepared for a certain occupation. It's another thing to say, if you pass that test, you have a college degree, or that defining a college degree as being prepared for a specific occupation. And it does seem to me that asking colleges to either, eliminate the things that employers haven't specifically requested, or, sort of be responsible for meeting those specific requirements. I mean, and obviously there has to be great coordination, but that we really need to think about which side these certifications should come from.
Right.
I would just say really quickly, until there are national standards, there are lots of proxies for that. So for apprenticeships, for example, there are clearly defined tests to be able to move forward to receive an apprenticeship. If you're going to be a welder, you have to pass the Department of Transportation bend test, for example. So depending upon the industry, there are some elements in there, some metrics that they need to pass. On top of that, for all of our community college vocational programs receiving Carl Perkins funding, it is a federal requirement that we have an advisory group. By its very nature, that advisory group is comprised of representatives from business and industry who are talking about specific outcomes that they want to see in the employees. And given so far that our community colleges are rurally serving, we're paying attention to the rural advisors, if you will, in those career programs.
Just one final point. The AACC, my organization, does have a grant from the Lumina Foundation. It's called The Right Signals. You should investigate it because it is designed to try to help our faculty members break apart the various program offerings into the components of what people are learning, and so that they can have greater relevance to the workforce.
I think there are two cautions, though. One is, so business sometimes has an interest in very specific skills and training. And it's not the role of the community college to tailor their curriculum so you can get the Cisco certification and you can't work on a Microsoft one. And secondly, we know that we're in a very dynamic situation, so I think you have to, some of this is equipping students to learn. I remember doing a story on Ford Motor Company went to a community college, I can't remember, maybe it was Macomb Community College, and they were interested in creating a training program for mechanics to work on cars which were becoming, this is a while ago, completely computerized. And they decided that they didn't want a certificate, they wanted an AA degree because they wanted to make sure that the students who graduated were capable 2 years from now of getting a CD from Ford and when they completely changed the fuel injection thing. So they made this as part of their shtick, that we don't want you just to learn how to fix the cars we're making today. We want to make sure you're flexible enough and open to fixing the cars we're going to make in 2 or 3 years from now. So there are a lot of, it's not obvious. It's easier to say than I think sometimes to do. You didn't come to hear me speak. Yes, ma'am.
I'm Carmen Oviedo, and I work for Delta Career Education, which is a vocational education company. And we actually have some partnerships with community colleges where they outsource some of their commercial driver's license education to us because they don't have the capacity to do that in-house. And we also have some employer partnerships where employers pay us specifically to train their students, and then at the end, they go and they have a job. Are you seeing any of those trends more broadly in the U.S. where community colleges have those partnerships with other educational institutions, or where employers have partnerships with community colleges or other educational institutions in order to fulfill that capacity, specifically for vocational education?
We're certainly seeing a lot of that out there. The Aspen Institute looked at partnerships between community colleges and community-based organizations who served as trainers to really support low-income, underprepared individuals, and really saw some success there. There's customized training as well through the workforce system that the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, also formerly the Workforce Innovation Act, will support employers' individual needs for skills training, and oftentimes that'll happen in a community college. So there's a lot of direct ties. There's apprenticeship, and a lot of the related instruction happens at community colleges. There's a lot of different ways those partnerships.
But it's would be unusual, David, wouldn't it, for a community college to outsource training to a for-profit?
It's on the margins, yes. It is a rare thing, although certainly cooperative arrangements with businesses and working with industry is widespread and has been so for many, many years. And I think the Great Recession caused a lot of people to discover that for the first time. You mentioned that in your opening statement, but there was as if community colleges hadn't been working with business until we had this economic collapse almost 10 years ago now, and nothing could be further from the truth.
Yeah, I have this fantasy that you could go to any panel on community colleges and I could give you 6 quotes and ask you what decade it was said, and you would have no way to know whether it was.
Maybe to your question, partnerships is in really the center name, the middle name of community colleges, and it happens with regard to private industry. I'm thinking in Michigan, we have a Michigan New Jobs Training Program. It takes withholding that is paid by the employee to the employer and then filed to the state of Michigan. The Michigan New Jobs Training Program allows that money to go directly to the community college to establish a training fund. That training fund can be administered by the community college or other private industries if the employer chooses. The employer may also want to say, we want you to hire our employees to train those people. So here you've got state government, you've got community college, and you've got the employer all working together, and in some cases that involves private providers as well.
So I want to provide incentives to people who ask questions online. This is from Robin Brasley, who's a doctoral student at Morgan State. And the question is, what challenges should future community college leaders be prepared for to advance the access and success equations that we identified?
For me, I would say the greatest challenge facing students moving into administration would be the culture. These institutions, though very young, a little more than 100 years old, still have an established culture. And those cultures could be everything from keeping tuition low to a certain way of doing things. I believe that we're going to have to be disruptors in higher education, that the new generation of leaders and faculty are going to have to question the status quo to be able to get to the very question that is being proposed here. New ways of thinking about Carnegie units and how we ascribe credit to students and how we provide stackable credentials over time and change. This is a very dynamic time, more so than any time in our history. And giving students the skill to take a little bit of knowledge and apply that in lots of different ways, to be flexible, to not have all the answers, to risk, are important skill sets that I think we need to imbue in our students and the leaders of community colleges as well, including trustees.
Gentleman there.
Mark Westenberg from the Council for Advancement and Support of Education. Just wanted to give you a quick question at the end here. Given the massively fluctuating environment that we live in, the landscape that we live that is just benchmarked by declining year-over-year enrollment numbers, all of this uncertainty, all of you have touched in some way, shape, or form on funding. What advice or recommendations would you give specifically to presidents, boards, and administrations of community colleges over the next 18 to 24 months regarding funding and how best to secure the funding that they need to do their jobs?
Oh, I'm glad I'm the moderator. You want to start?
Well,
We'll all come and support your millage thing next time. Just give us
thank you.
got nowhere to go but up.
I think the challenge is the perception the pendulum is swinging more to a private good, so I would prepare institutions for more of a private good environment, but encouraging and lobbying for increasing levels of support. I think both from federal and state government, and also trying to figure out a way to keep costs as low as possible, but realizing that there's got to be a cost share among lots of different folks. But the private good issue is the most concerning to me.
Lauren?
I would say, governments, federal, state, local, really need to think about how CTE programs are funded. They can often be more expensive. Equipment and training needs are always evolving in many ways, and so how funding can best support training programs that stay up to date on the skills that employers need.
I think community colleges and all of higher education need to make sure that they don't lose the trust of the American public. One of the things that amazes me and deeply disturbs our organization is the fact that fewer Americans think that post-secondary education writ large is necessary to achieve a middle-class lifestyle. I think there are many factors that are contributing to that, but at a time when it is quite clear that some form of post-secondary education is necessary for a decent lifestyle and standard of living, that we have fewer people thinking that you need college to attain that, when that is absolutely not the case, is something that we need to address. And I think community colleges, as was referred to earlier, our enrollments are declining somewhat. Enrollments at the four-year institutions are ticking up a little bit. So I think there's a particular issue with community colleges and how we are presenting ourselves to the public, despite all the good publicity that we have received over the last number of years. But I think that higher education has an image refurbishment that needs to take place, and I guess community colleges are going to have to be part of it.
And I think we need to realize that one of the things that's happened is that we don't fund workforce development and we just say college. And we have to start being much more explicit about the fact that one of the things we are now asking colleges, particularly community colleges, to do is prepare people for occupations. And we should be funding that, and we should be funding that very specifically, and probably people shouldn't have to pay for a lot of what they have to pay for in terms of getting that training. So we have to stop just thinking of college and thinking about this workforce issue.
I think a lot of this is a political strategy question. I think one part is, I agree with pretty much everything that's been said here, so not to repeat people. But I think the other thing is that first of all, there's not going to be a lot of money. So the question is, how do you deal with that reality? It means building local support, because there's going to be less money from Washington. Secondly, I think it's describing, as Sandy did a little bit, about what is the community college in particular a solution to? It's kind of a bit bizarre that we have this widespread angst that you can't get a good job, your kids aren't going to do well, we're losing our edge, and that we don't see community colleges as a solution. So I think the community colleges have to design themselves to be seen as a solution to a problem, which they've done pretty well. And the third thing is, look, we're in an era where people demand accountability, and it's not enough although it's correct to say, well, the way the government measures things is misleading, I think people are going to demand a better way to do it. And there I think the community colleges are a bit of both a disadvantage because of the way David said measured it, but also, you know, I'm kind of a little, my own personal prejudice, I'm a little tired of hearing from the presidents of the Ivy League that we shouldn't measure earnings. It's not a good standard of an education. Well, maybe that's true if you go to Harvard or Yale. But for people who go to community colleges, it seems to me it's incredibly important for people who are coming because they want to get a better job to help them know what is it that's going to get a better job, why you should not do the cafeteria approach. We have to find a way to make the colleges accountable, but to give the students the information that they need, recognizing it's not only going to be consumer choice that drives us. And we seem to be sometimes caught in this, well, we're afraid that measurement and accountability will expose our vulnerabilities. And I think that's an unsuccessful strategy. So with that sermon, I thank everybody for coming and for people who watched online, but particularly for the panel for such a lively discussion.
Thank you.